So, Renato, were Trump's military strikes in Iran justified?
It's complicated.
I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal and national security analyst.
And I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Mark Hertling. I was a soldier for 4 decades. My last job was in U.S. Army Europe, which included the Levant at the time. And I'm a student of national security and leadership.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a skeet. So we are very excited today. I feel like we have scored, I don't know that this is not the right metaphor right now. I was going to say we've scored a coup, but, under the circumstances. But we do have an expert. We have General Mark Hertling. General, thank you so much for being with us. We're so excited to get your insight on what's going on.
You're very welcome, and I'm pleased to join both of you, but please call me Mark. Or if you don't, I'll start calling both of you Counselor, okay?
Okay, fair enough. So a lot has been unfolding since last week, and maybe we can just start with what was your reaction, I guess, when you first learned that we had basically joined Israel in engaging in these strikes? What were the initial thoughts that went through your mind?
Well, I think the first thing I thought of was, okay, what is, first of all, the plan? What kind of forethought has gone behind this? What kind of coordination has been made? Who has been informed? Truthfully, Asher, there were all sorts of things going through my mind. The fact that we were striking did not surprise me because I thought that Israel had such an influence over this current administration that we would come to the aid of an ally with a capability that they did not have. And of course, for the last 20 or so years, Israel's been trying to negate Iran's capability to use or to produce and then use nuclear weapons. And they seem to be at an advantageous place right now where they could culminate those operations that have been going on for so many years and really damage the Iranian capabilities. But knowing what they had to do to strike these deeply buried targets and knowing what the Israeli military has, I knew that they would need our help to really destroy these capabilities that are under about 90 feet of granite and reinforced by concrete in the Iranian desert. So I was not surprised. I was a little taken aback at the timing based on Trump saying, hey, it's going to be in the next 2 weeks, I'm going to make a decision. But I was a little bit miffed at the fact that no one on the Democratic side of the House of Representatives or the Senate, the so-called Gang of Eight, knew anything about it. Because usually when a president conducts an operation like this against a foreign adversary, at least the intelligence folks will notify the key members of the other body of legislators, and that's the Senate and the Congress. So there were some really interesting dynamics that occurred as soon as the strike was announced, but then it got even sportier when you heard the president appear before a microphone and say these targets had all been obliterated minutes after the strike had been conducted, which I knew not to be the case. Not that they weren't obliterated, but the fact that the president would know it so quickly. I mean, even in the bin Laden raid, when the Special Operations Forces captured and killed basically bin Laden in Pakistan, it took a while for Bill McRaven to take the body back to run DNA tests to ensure that it was bin Laden, and then to notify the president, and then took even longer for the president to realize the implications of what had just happened and announce it to the world in a very serious way. So those were all my thoughts within the first couple of hours of this attack.
Yeah, wow. I mean, you've really introduced a lot to us, Mark, because a lot of things, I think some things I want to unpack, right? I mean, you talked about this Gang of Eight. This is really the leadership and foreign policy leadership of both houses of Congress. And the reason that it was speaking here as a lawyer, the reason that um, you would have a notification of Congress is, of course, because under Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress has the power to declare war, not the president. And there's something called the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which is, something that was enacted in the midst of, towards the latter end of the Vietnam War, and was meant to ensure that a president was not escalating a military conflict without congressional approval, and really requires notification of congressional leadership. Now, the timing of that comes into question because I believe the wording of the War Powers Resolution is that you have to notify Congress within 48 hours of military action. But here, generally the practice has always been that you notify in advance.
Well, the War Powers Resolution also has a consultation clause that says that in every possible instance that the president has to consult with Congress before the attack, but then for sure within 48 hours after. Of course, there's no it's up to the president what's every possible instance, and there's no clear definition of consult. So, he could pick up the phone and call Lindsey Graham, I guess. But you were surprised. I mean, this does seem like one of those instances, right, Mark? I mean, this was not the kind of thing where, even in the bin Laden raid, which, you have like this small window of time that you must act. I mean, this didn't have that kind of, seemed to me, from my perspective, to have that kind of pressure, nor were we under sort of some imminent danger that the president had to act so quickly that he couldn't have done something.
Yeah, that's the phrase I was going to use, Asha, is the imminent danger piece. And that's critically important within the War Powers Act. Now, I'm not a lawyer like you two, but I know what it looks like on the field. So when you're in danger, or when the United States is in danger and the president is receiving intelligence that says that, and he has to act right now, then certainly you can understand the fact that he would go to Congress later on and talk about it and provide consent. But at the same time, there is, as you mentioned, the notification piece of it. But I'll put it in a different perspective beyond the legal piece. Why is it so important to notify Congress? Well, I think because we realize, and I'm going to get a little militarily geeky here and say that there's this guy named Clausewitz, who was a old Prussian general, who said whenever a nation goes to war, they should have three things. He calls it the triad. And it consists of a very good military, a government that you trust, and a people, a citizenry that supports you. So what's that have to do with what we're talking about? Well, the way to get the citizenry support feeling, do they support us, is through Congress, because the representatives of Congress are representing the people that act as the citizenry. So there is this feeling that, yes, the president needs to make decisions that have to do with war and going to war and interstate commerce and international relations, but it is the people that give him the choice to say, hey, we are a threat and we support you. Because if he doesn't get that support, the war is not going to be successful in the same way as if you had a really lousy military, you're not going to be successful. So all these things kind of fit together beyond just the legal implications.
Sorry. One other thing I just wanted to point out, I think is important here, is, Asha, I think you mentioned a moment ago, the discretion, really, that the language of this resolution offers the president to confer with Congress in advance. And one of the things that I think was concerning to many people, and myself included, was the language that was being thrown out by Republicans to justify the lack of notification to Democrats. Essentially, that the Democrats are like the enemy within. And that if you talk to them about what you're doing, that somehow this meant that they were going to leak it to the, Iranian religious Islamic government. And it's very dangerous a place for us to be as a country when we literally have Republicans viewing Democrats as the enemy within. It's the sort of rhetoric that led to a lot of persecution and ultimately killing of opponents in certain countries. And it really goes back to what we talked about in our last podcast about political violence and the normalization of political violence.
Yeah.
And can I just add, because I have a question for Mark on this, on that piece. It's funny that they claim to be concerned about leaks, because I'm curious, Mark, what you think about the fact that Trump was telegraphing this. Like, even in the 2 weeks, I'm going to decide in 2 weeks. It seems to me as if this is something that you are seriously considering. This is not, you don't want to telegraph it. You don't want to give the target any advance notice of, that this is something you're planning, because I think this will get to, some follow-up questions that I'm sure we both have about the effectiveness of this operation. I mean, doesn't that just give them time to take preemptive measures, to give Iran time to take preemptive measures? Because now, Trump is kind of tweeting his way through it, I guess.
Well, yeah, I think it does. And that is an interesting point, because Iran had already received information that something was going to happen months ago from the Israelis. As soon as they started losing their air defense capabilities and their air force to the Israeli fighters, which was significant over a period of a couple of weeks. And they probably knew that Israel was going to do exactly what they did. When President Trump got involved, it became a given that he was going to be talked into. I mean, intelligence organizations in every country can read between the lines, and they know what's going to happen. That's what's so sophomoric about this whole discussion. A lot of people knew this was going to happen, more than likely, or that President Trump could be talked into it by Prime Minister Netanyahu. So that gives more credence to the fact that there was the potential that Iran moved a lot of their nuclear capabilities away from the sites that are the most famous in targeting procedures. And again, that also, and I know we're going to talk about this in a minute, that gave our intelligence community the capability of finding out what was going on there before we struck those sites. So it was Israel that really said, here are the places we'd ask you to drop the massive ordnance penetrators, the MOPs, because this is where we think their major facilities are. And yet there are indicators from the intelligence community that Iran knew that too, so they moved a lot of their things. But if I can, real quickly, I want to go back to the use of force in the War Powers Act just very quickly. I think that particular subject has been so vaporized over the last 20 years because of the war on terror and the AUMF, the Authorization of Use of Military Force, that was voted on by Congress in the early 2000s, but it's been the excuse for using force all over the world for things beyond a strike on terrorists, with a little bit of fudgy legal language that presidents from Bush to Trump have said, well, we're still using the AUMF for our rationale for attacking these places. And that seems to go outside the legal and practical ramifications of the Congressional War Powers Act.
That's a really smart comment, because I will say that one of my concerns here was that the unilateral use of a president's power to engage in acts of war has become commonplace. It's become normalized, where strikes by a president, and really I'd say this is a bipartisan thing, have become normalized, that this is what we expect, rather than having a congressional debate and a discussion.
Right. And again, going back to the congressional piece, is it good for the nation, or is it just a blanket hall pass that you can start using military force whenever you feel like you should use it? And it also takes away, in my view, it takes away from the other elements of national power: the use of diplomacy, the use of information, the use of economic means, that all make up the national strength that we should be using before using that very first hammer of the military against all enemies.
Well, and I think Renato made a good point that this is sort of bipartisan in terms of presidents doing this. I like to tell my students, presidents are going to president. I mean, this is not a Republican or Democrat thing. And in fact, under the Obama administration, Obama used the AUMF to justify what they called preemptive self-defense,
right?
To commit, to do drone attacks. And then also the strikes in Libya, one of the arguments that they made there, because there's another provision of the War Powers Resolution, which starts the 60-day clock, right? And that's if the president introduces armed forces into hostilities. And what the Obama administration argued in that case was that those strikes weren't hostilities because there weren't boots on the ground and there wasn't a risk of escalation. And so I'm curious what you think about where this falls on that hostility. Is this a one and done? We were getting different justifications after the fact, right? One was it sounded like this preemptive self-defense, like we need to stop them from having nuclear capabilities, though it wasn't clear how imminent it is. Then later we had Trump sort of hinting about regime change, which seems to me to be a much longer term goal that is not really self-defense related. So I'm just curious what you think about the risk of escalation here, whether this is something that holds the potential for us to draw us into something longer. I mean, it seems right now like it's okay. Maybe this was a one and done. I don't know. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, well, I would go on the side, and I said at the very beginning, this is not a one and done when everyone was saying that. And it's because of the way the administration conducted the buildup to it. When you're talking about using a contingency operation like this was, there's a whole lot of wargaming, what if drills, risk mitigations, the red teaming piece where you say, okay, this is what we're about to do. At least this is how I used to do it. This is what we're about to do. What could go wrong? What could throw us off our plan? What could make us unsuccessful? And once we know all those things and assume some things that could or could not happen, then we have to develop branches and sequels to the plan. So again, I'm postulating here because no one knows for sure right now, but if this strike, which was executed perfectly, according to the president, and it was from a military perspective, the folks flying the airplanes and hitting the pinpoint targets and shooting the Tomahawk missiles, they were all very courageous in their actions and they did some great stuff. Okay, I will give them that, which is what their current defense is. Oh, you guys are negating all these great soldiers and airmen and sailors and what they did. I'm not degrading that at all. I'm just saying, did it have an effect? Did you accomplish the thing that you're saying you accomplished? Notwithstanding the bravery of the military that went in there, did you do what you wanted to do? And I would suggest there's doubt in that arena. So if that is the case and there's doubt about having effects on the targets, accomplishing the actions that you wanted to accomplish at 100%. And by the way, I'm going to go back to that because there's no military operation that executes their mission at 100% level. If there is a lack of mission accomplishment, then what does that mean? Do we have to do it again? Do we have to do strikes in the future? Was the timing right the first time? Did we have enough intelligence? Were the key decision makers making the right decisions? Those are all the questions that I think we should ask the decision makers, the president and his team. And that's another reason why Congress should be involved beforehand versus afterwards.
So one thing that I found very interesting, Mark, was the response of some other nations around the world, particularly Russia. And you saw Medvedev, the man who was who stepped in as president because Putin couldn't serve consecutive terms before there was a change in the Constitution. So Putin served his term, then he stepped aside, and his lackey came in as president, and then Putin came back. But he made a statement publicly, basically saying, haha, you didn't destroy everything, and we're going to do what we can to help Iran get nuclear weapons. And there was a sense to which Iran and Russia had a close relationship. Both nations are increasingly isolated. Did this potentially actually drive Iran more into an alignment with Russia?
I don't think so. And the reason I say that is because, as much as Iran has given Russia in terms of military equipment like drones, we also have to mention that Iran went to Russia like the day after and said, hey, bro, how about a little help down here? I'm getting these big guys attacking me. And Putin said, no, thanks. So I think Mr. Putin is ecstatic that the United States has been drawn into this conflict between Iran and Israel because it's even less attention being paid to Ukraine, which is his raison d'etre today. I mean, that's what he wants. That's what Russia wants. They like alliances when they help them. They don't like alliances so much when when Russia has to help the other part of the alliance. So he's allowing all of this I think he's allowing all of this to bubble inside of Iran with the United States distracted in this area and Trump going through all kinds of churn because of it. And he can continue to try and pressure Ukraine. And it also gets to something that I said was a Russian strategic objective in February of 22, and that is continue to divide the NATO alliance and continue to use the divisions in the United States as a reason to conduct his operations in Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe. So I think he's got a big gain on this. The one nation that I think is fascinating to watch right now is China and what they're doing. China and North Korea, because North Korea is kind of getting screwed on this too, because they had a deal after giving troops to Russia to fight in their war. They kind of thought they would get a whole lot of technology advances on nuclear weapons. And now that's at the forefront of what everyone's looking at.
So I guess if Russia is not, going to step in and help Iran move forward with nuclear capabilities, I guess let me just play devil's advocate. So what? So what if we have to go back in another 6 months because they're back up to speed or something? In other words, if we have escalation dominance, right? Like, in other words, if realistically Iran can't really do anything about it, let's set aside the domestic legal piece for a second, that, it's not super great from, our citizenry perspective to have, a president just going rogue all over the place with the military. But what's the harm if we're not going to really get drawn into a war? Or do you think that is possible? Is an ongoing conflict really a realistic consequence of this, even if this was not successful this time around?
I think the possibility of an ongoing conflict and a greater conflict in the Middle East is certainly successful. I think and this is a big if Iran has saved some of their nuclear capability in this strike, and some indicators say that they have, is there going to be a greater rush to a nuclear weapon because they've seen what happens when they don't have one. And that is when it might become an existential threat, not just for Israel, but for others, if they can attach it to a rocket and hit other places in the world. So yeah, but then you also have the issue of, what do we do in the meantime? Do we just stand by and wait? Do we take Israel's advice on what to do next? Or do we invade? And if we invade and finish the job, as it were, or go in for other strikes, we are then committing the same kind of international crime that we've accused Russia of doing over the last 3 years in invading Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, there was, of course, those posts by Trump on his own social media site talking about regime change at one point. And obviously, having a surgical bombing strike and then declaring a ceasefire is not regime change. But if that ultimately is on the table and an end goal, that literally is a full commitment of U.S. firepower and boots in the ground and really trying to remake a society in the way that we did in Iraq.
Yeah, and what I'll tell you too on that, Renata, it's a great point because unfortunately I have a whole lot of scar tissue as regards to regime change. Being the war planner in the Pentagon in 2003, when the attack plans to go into Iraq were first being tabled, it was go in and get the weapons of mass destruction. That was the first mission. And then it gradually changed to, and oh, by the way, create regime change too and get Saddam Hussein out of the government. Well, what I'll tell you is, from a military standpoint, that ain't a mission we practice a whole lot. We don't go to the training centers and say, okay, today we're going to train on regime change, because that talks about replacing an entire government. Yet we were drawn into that. And that's why, when I was there 5 years after the war started and my second tour there, we were doing things like trying to build up the legal system in Iraq, trying to put the schools back together, get governments taking care of their people, fixing the economy, and also trying to kill Al Qaeda and other insurgency groups. So it's kind of a hard mission set for a military commander to conduct regime change, and it takes a whole lot more than what people think. And the other thing I'd point out, that Iran is about 4 times the size of Iraq, and they have about 5 times as many people. There are 91 million citizens in Iran, and they are not the Shia Sunni Kurdish divide like Iraq was. There's about 20 different nation groups inside of Iran that could really cause problems if you're talking about turning the government over. Now, if that happens and they're able to control it internally versus with help, as opposed to with help from other nations, then good on them. That's a good thing for the Iranian people, because they're the ones who are suffering the most right now.
Well, if that is sort of the plan that it ends up happening, I think there's no question that will definitely would, at least from a legal perspective, Congress would have to be involved for some kind of long-term thing like that. Because just to clarify, so that there's no confusion, I don't think there's any argument right now that any of this is covered by the 2001 AUMF or even the 2002 AUMF that covered Iraq at that time. And I don't even think this administration is trying to argue that. So that's a good thing to flag, that this could be a much longer endeavor.
You'll be happy to hear this, Asha, because you were the one that coined this phrase. But I'm kind of on an informal network, a text stream, not signals, but a text stream with a bunch of retired generals. And as soon as the tweet came up from President Trump that mentioned regime change, I would tell you that whole text stream lit up. And the first person that said something was, "Oh boy, here we go." So that's, I think they didn't attribute it to you, but I knew that's where that came from.
We'll see how this unfolds, and if it goes further, we'll definitely have you back. So, Mark, while we have you here, we would be remiss if we also did not talk about the domestic situation and how the military is getting sucked into that. And I am curious what your take is on, that whole shit show, basically. That we're seeing happening.
It's a good way to describe it. It is, there is, in many people's view, and I'm one of them, an attempt to politicize the military, whereas at the same time, an attempt to insult the institution of the military, which is fascinating to me. I happen to have the chance to have been at both the West Point graduation this year to hear President Trump speak, and then later on watch him on TV as he spoke to soldiers at Fort Bragg. And in both cases, there was a visible attempt of politicizing the audiences and getting them on his side. And I find that extremely troubling from a civil military affairs standpoint. The military exists to serve the country. They do not exist to serve one man. And there's a constant drumbeat about loyalty toward Trump. One of the things I did when I was commanding in Europe is when I did engagements with other nations, I would always ask their soldiers, where do you swear allegiance to? And there would be when we take our oath, we swear allegiance to the king or the queen or the motherland or the fatherland or the president or whatever. We don't do that. We swear our allegiance to a piece of paper, that constitution that represents ideas and culture and ideology. And it's backed up by, papers and conversations and speeches that have taken place over the last 250 years. So when you see an individual who is trying to gain loyalty and fire people willy-nilly, I'll use that phrase that my mother used to use all the time, of firing people because they don't seem to have any real competence problems, but they happen to be of a certain race or a certain gender, that's problematic to me because our military is extremely diverse in its nature. Then when you also see the militarization of ICE agents, border patrols, and police on the street, all wearing camouflage dress and body armor and carrying M4s or M16s and long rifles and have NOD helmets on and all that other stuff, you say to yourself, holy smokes, there's an attempt to, in our country where only about 1% of our citizens serve in the military, there's an attempt to confuse on who's on which side. And then when you introduce the National Guard, which is legal, as you know, he can federalize the Guard if he wants. He usually has to get permission from the governor because that is the governor's military. But he did it, and the court ruled in favor of him. But you also are putting Marines on the streets of our city. I think that's an attempt to further confuse the citizenry of who's in charge and who's loyal to who. And truthfully, what I've watched is the American support for institutions, the courts, the law, the Congress, and the military. And what I'm seeing is the public support for the military is declining from a very high level that occurred in the early 2000s to now. And it's especially gone off the cliff in terms of some of these things and I get feedback from people saying, how come you guys don't step in and stop this? Well, because the generals won't stop this. You elected the guy. It's up to you to stop it. We're here to defend the country. But people are now seeing us as a hedge against some of his actions. So that's kind of a long dialogue, or diatribe, I guess. But those are some of the things that are happening to the military that really concern me, as they should be apolitical, and people should realize we serve the nation and not one individual.
One thing that you mentioned, that a lot of citizens were wondering, hey, why isn't the military stepping in? There's one person in particular who had a very important role in ensuring that the military wasn't politicized, and that was General Milley. And by his own telling, it sounds like he, at times, stepped up to ensure that there wasn't a misuse of the military. And that has made him an enemy of the current president, who has tried to turn him into a sort of an enemy within, just like he did with James Comey, the director of the FBI, and many others.
Anthony Fauci.
Yes, exactly.
All the leaders of key institutions in America. The press, he's going after the press now. So, yeah, I'm sorry for interrupting, but yeah, that's part of the game plan.
Well, and I was wondering what your reaction was to that, because General Milley, of course, was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and had a very distinguished military career. And it was apparent to me that he had great respect for the apolitical nature of our military.
Yeah. And what I'd also add to that some people may have forgotten, is that Trump picked Milley over the advice of the Secretary of Defense, who wanted someone else. So he was Trump's pick. And then because he lived up to his oath and understood civil military relations and tried to establish that firewall between politicalization of the military, he's now one of the bad guys. So my feeling on that is, I know General Milley not well. He and I ran in different circles. He was an infantry guy. I was a tanker. So we didn't clash too often, but I did know of him. And the fact is, I mean, he's got it right from his ideology and his oath to the Constitution. So this is a perfect example of how the good guys, when they don't bend the knee or take the bow, suddenly become the bad guys. And even to the point of being threatened and their families being threatened.
So, Mark, what does that mean now with the change in the leadership? Right. So we obviously have Pete Hegseth as the Secretary of Defense. As you mentioned, we have Marines deployed in LA. I suspect that we're going to see military in other cities as well. And Trump has, or Hegseth, I guess, has, he dismissed the original, the JAGs that were in place, and I don't know if he's replaced them. How does this all translate on the ground? Like, we know, I mean, I assume, soldiers and Marines are all taught about posse comitatus. I don't, and my guess is they are also not trained to do law enforcement. I mean, law enforcement and being in a war are very different things. They should be different things. Do you feel confident? We talk about you don't have to follow an illegal order and people, but where does that happen? Like, who does that? Whose call is it? And where, who would know to say no? We're not talking about like to burn this village, burn down LA and, kill everybody. I mean, short of that.
Yeah, it is, to answer your question very simply, it's the commander's call. The commander of any formation is responsible for what his or her troops do. And they're the ones that know that it's wrong to execute an illegal order, that they have to stand up for that they have to stop that. Context of the two speeches I saw. At the West Point speech, where you had 1,000 brand new lieutenants sitting in front of President Trump, and he was starting the politicalization in his speech, insulting the previous presidents, insulting the generals, saying, I mean, it was really pretty disgusting. The 1,000 cadets up there had a poker face. They were sitting in the audience. There was no applause. There was nothing going on because they had been told by their chain of command, beforehand, you may have your views, but if you're wearing the uniform, you don't show any political lean. Whereas the troops at Fort Bragg, which really was embarrassing to me, and I think embarrassing to their commanders, were not only not told that, it appears, but they were allowed to be part of a mob scene, standing behind the president and cheering. Now, in the military, because we draw our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines and Coast Guard and Space Force people from the population, you're going to have different views. But they are taught from all of our military personnel are taught from basic training that their personal views don't matter if they're wearing the uniform. What matters is their support for the country. And what they're also taught is the legalities of taking orders, either illegal or immoral orders. So, but it's up to the commanders to enforce that. So you see these guys on the ground doing different things. And there was the famous picture of the Marine putting the flex cuffs on the one guy that was trying to get into a building. That was one incident. And there was a lot made of that incident. And it was some guy, some Marine trying to do the best he could to guard a building. But I'm sure he was, chided afterwards by his commander saying, that's not our job. We are not the police. We're here to guard the building. So knock it off. But the things that's troubling when those guys showed up, what I noticed is some things that probably most Americans would not have noticed is they had flex cuffs on their vest. They had weapons, unloaded more than likely, but they had weapons. And you don't, unless you use those for your personal defense when you're in a bad situation, you shouldn't be flashing those around. So there's some nuance in all of this, Asha, and it's really hard to convince people that the military knows what they're doing. And the reason it's hard to convince them of that is because every once in a while, some young 18-year-old does something dumb and it taints the whole organization. Now, what I will say is one more thing. It was fascinating for me to see in the press conference the day after the bombing that Secretary Hegseth and Chairman Kane, Chairman of Joint Staff General Kane, were at the two platforms. Hegseth said one thing about, I backed the president on everything he said about it, obliterated it. When they went to Kane, he said, well, we still got to do BDA and we're not sure what happened yet. So he was doing what the military does. But one thing that I would point out, in all of the meetings except the night before the bombing, you're seeing a lot of meetings with President Trump, Secretary Rubio, Secretary Hegseth, and all of his cabinet in committee meetings, what used to be called primary committees, but the military representative is not there. That concerns me. Where's Kane when those things are going on? Or where is his vice chairman? Because the SecDef and the chairman both have equal voices in those rooms. And what I'm concerned about is how tough is it for Dan Kane to do what he's been trained to do in that kind of an environment?
Well, I will say, from my perspective as a citizen, there's a lot to be concerned about. I think there's so much at stake for our country, and really the politicization of the military can be a threat to the Constitution. So I appreciate your voice. I appreciate you coming on and sharing this with us, because you're an example of somebody who's really standing up for the Constitution. So thank you, Mark. I really appreciate you joining us. I feel like we've learned a lot from you.
Well, thanks to both of you, because not only is the military and the media, the journalists, important and are specifically named in the Constitution, but so is the importance of the rule of law. So we got something going on between the three of us, right?
Yes,
That's
for sure. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So, Asha, before we go, where are you? And it doesn't look like your usual backdrop.
So I am in Vermont. You see my little Queechy sign and my little Vermont. So, my house in Connecticut was built in 1927, and it does not have air conditioning. And I hadn't put.
Holy cow!
Yeah, and I didn't have time to put in a window unit downstairs. They're up in the kids' bedrooms and stuff, but I had to get out of here, get out of there.
Yeah.
And come here.
I could see that. I'm in DC, and it has literally been like 96, 98 degrees the entire time I've been here. So I'm looking forward. I'm going to be catching my flight momentarily, and I am glad to get back to Chicago, where things are not quite as hot as they are everywhere else.
Yeah, I see that you are in as snazzy of a hotel room as you were in Williamsburg.
Yeah, right. Although the chairs are slightly more comfortable, but yes, this is the excitement of being on a Marriott. It is what it is. It's part of the downside of business travel. But no matter where we're at, it seems like we can't get away from the heat.
Yeah. Well, stay cool, and we'll tune in next week.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.